What is the optimal subsidy for residential solar? That's the title of a new paper in the journal Science Direct. And I'm going to interview one of its co-authors, Eric Hittinger, who is from the Rochester Institute of Technology. So welcome to the interview, Eric.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Now, I'm very interested in this because, of course, subsidies in some quarters anyway have been quite controversial. And sometimes the subsidies are considered to be too generous. I think Ontario in Canada would be an example of that. They were quite controversial. But so, you've gone and put together a cost benefit analysis model to estimate that for all of the 50 states. So maybe we could start with, if you could give us an overview of your paper, please.
Yeah, so the question is exactly as you proposed. We're trying to figure out what's the optimal subsidy for residential solar. And we take the perspective here that subsidies are kind of a way for governments to purchase emissions reductions, okay, for clean energy technology. There's different perspectives. You could include costs of energy or savings on energy and other things like that. But we look at it from sort of a social planner perspective. Government spends this money and they want to get emissions reductions. And we ask, what emissions reductions do they get? The important additional thing that we look at in this paper, a lot of people have asked, well, what are the emissions reductions from solar? And what is the value of reducing those emissions? But the thing that we do here is we also include indirect benefits from technological progress. So if the government subsidizes solar today, it will drive additional adoption of solar today. And that additional adoption will make solar cheaper through technological progress for people into the future. And it will drive greater adoption of solar into the future, which will also have emissions benefits. And taking that into account gives you, frankly, pretty different answers than if you ignore it.
Okay, so that to a guy who took history and English in university instead of math, that sounds very complicated. So, but I can imagine now you putting this model together for all 50 states. And what did you come up with a number? Is that the idea? So much per kilowatt hour of solar? How did that work?
Yeah, so we produced numbers, subsidy per kilowatt of rooftop solar. Our main base case values looked at a flat subsidy over the whole United States. It's kind of realistic that the US government is going to offer the same amount of money to everyone, no matter where they live. Although we find that to actually be a little bit inefficient, though politically expedient at least. And yeah, we come up with actual numbers, which today, I think the most useful way to express that is in comparison to what the subsidy is from the federal government today. And we actually found that for today, the federal subsidy level seems to be actually approximately correct, which is a little surprising. Usually you do this analysis and you say, oh, it's way too high or way too low, but surprisingly, we kind of agree with where policymakers have ended up.
Does this give the policymakers the option then of looking at your model and saying, okay, if we've more or less got it right now, according to this analysis, we should be reducing it by X amount over the next 5, 10, 15 years, whatever that is. And then that gets us to a point where we're not subsidizing solar at all.
Yes, absolutely. So the model tends to prefer declining subsidies that basically decline down to zero eventually. And the reason for that, why would you ever reduce a subsidy for a clean energy technology? And the reason for that is the cost of what is called free riders. So today, the economics of solar are pretty good in a lot of places, even without subsidy. This wasn't true 10 years ago, but it means that even if you didn't subsidize it, there's a lot of people that would still adopt rooftop solar. And if you offer a subsidy, then you pay the subsidy to those people as well. So you're essentially paying money from the government's coffers to people who were already going to buy the rooftop solar. And that's, from the government's perspective, that's sort of a pure cost. And as the economics of solar improve, there's more and more free riders. So the model suggests that you decline the total amount of subsidy towards zero.
So what kind of numbers are we talking about, Eric? I mean, what is the federal tax credit now that your analysis shows is fairly correct? And where should it go, or where should the dollar amount go over time?
Yeah, so I think it's most useful to think about it in terms of percent of the cost of a solar system, because in the US, that's how the federal tax credit is structured. So for a long time, it was 30% of the cost of a rooftop solar system was basically given back to you as a federal tax credit. We're in a transition period where that's being slowly phased down right now, but our analysis went up to the year, or started at the year 2018, when it would have still been at the 30% level. And our model basically said that for the year 2018, it should have been a bit lower, actually about half that. It should have been about 15% of the cost of the rooftop solar system.
And when should it get down to zero?
It slowly declines to zero. I think it hits zero in the base case after about 15 years or so, which is a slower, more gradual process than what we'll probably see. But a lot of those years, the model is giving numbers that are pretty close to zero. They would be pretty small subsidies.
And I would imagine, because I've looked at the Lazard levelized cost of energy estimates for residential solar. I mean, it's still pretty expensive. It's not like utility scale solar, for example, which is down around $30 a megawatt hour. I think it's more up around 125 or 150, if I remember correctly. So at what point why does it get to zero in 15 years? Is that because it's now residential solar is competitive with utility scale electricity?
Probably not competitive. It's more a balance of the benefits in terms of learning and tech progress. So the model basically believes that, starting now, but getting more true over the next 15 years, that the tech progress is going to kind of slow down because the technology is becoming more mature. So you're getting less of that indirect technology progress benefit. And at the same time, you have a growing pool of free riders. So as solar gets cheaper, our adoption model says that more people will purchase it. And so just the balance of these different effects brings you slowly to zero.
Now, you're talking about a federal tax credit. Everybody gets the same tax credit. Is there any consideration given to adjusting that depending on where the tax recipient lives? So for instance, if you're in sunny California, where everybody seems to have solar, as opposed to rainy Washington state, probably not as much solar, one would imagine. So what about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we did look at that. And we said, what if instead of offering a subsidy that was the same for everyone in the United States, that the federal government could offer a different subsidy in each state? Now that probably wouldn't be very politically popular, but we said, let's just see what the results show. And what they show is that you would offer a pretty different subsidy, much higher in some places, like the Midwest US, where the solar is displacing really dirty electricity, a lot of coal power in the Midwest. So the emissions benefits are much larger. And the economics aren't as good because electricity is cheaper and it's not particularly sunny. And a lot lower of a subsidy in California. As you said, California is sunny. They also have high electricity prices, so people naturally are interested in solar. So you reduce paying those free riders in California if you can reduce the subsidy there. And you can focus your efforts in the Midwest. And overall, we found that a scenario like this gives you about 3 times as much net benefit to society in terms of emissions reductions.
Now, final question, Eric, and do you have an answer? Maybe you don't, but do you have an answer to those critics who said that it shouldn't have never been subsidized, that there isn't enough benefit to society from giving people 30% of their residential solar installation? What's your take on that?
Yeah, I would say almost the opposite. Well, I've just told you that Today, the subsidy is too high. What we found in the model is that if you look back a few years, go back to, let's say, 2012, we found that in the year 2012, the subsidy was quite a bit too low. And in years before that, it was much too low. And the reason is because of this technological progress effect. If you get a technology that's in an early stage, like solar would have been around 2008, 2010 or so, and you believe that it has a lot of possibility for technological progress, our model says you should subsidize it really high in those early periods to push it down that technological progress curve, to bring down the costs as fast as possible so that it can achieve broad adoption very quickly. And so what our model says, which I think is rather commonsensical, is that when a technology is new, really high government support is appropriate, but as it becomes more mature because of the free rider problem, you want to slowly phase out those subsidies and eventually put them down to zero in some cases.
Well, that raises an interesting question, and I know this is beyond the scope of your paper, Eric, but if you took that approach, then you could see if there was such a thing as a common sense politician, they would go to the voters and say, look, this is going to have benefits down the road. So we're going to spend a lot of your money today because in a period of 5, 10, 15 years down the road, we're going to spend a lot less of your money. So this is an efficient way of spending your tax dollars to get a big benefit for society and for the economy as a whole. And not that I don't think I've ever heard a politician say that, but it seems to me that would be the sort of political logic of your model.
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly right. I think, to be fair to politicians that don't do this, there is some risk or uncertainty involved, right? So with solar, we can look back and say, well, look, solar got really cheap, but perhaps that was a little less obvious in 2008 that it would be able to fall in price quite so quickly as it did. But there's ways to look at potential of technologies and try and interrogate this. But I can see why a politician might be a bit nervous about committing huge amounts of money to something that they think has a lot of potential.
Sure, but this actually has practical applications, because here we are in the wake of the International Energy Agency's Net Zero to 2050 report, which says that you have to invest trillions in some of these new technologies, like carbon capture and storage, or maybe small modular reactors, whatever it might be. And so if governments are going to be spending taxpayers' dollars anyway, you might as well have a good story to tell them and use solar as an example of, as a success story.
Yeah, absolutely. Solar's a huge success story. The other one is batteries. But we have some other technologies out there on the horizon that are further up the learning curve, things like electrolyzers for hydrogen, I would say, that have a lot of, they're in earlier stages, but they have a huge potential. And this is a nice, the lessons from this paper are mostly things that people already know or believe qualitatively, but, we used a model which, has its weaknesses, but also can be more convincing in some quarters. And it's an easier thing to interrogate than the basic idea.
Eric, this actually has been a very interesting conversation, and I really appreciate your insights. Thank you very much for doing this.
Yeah, thanks for having me.